Hello, welcome back to the Heroes Forge. Today, in honor of the start of June and how a lot of people go ahead and bring up Pride Month and things like that, I think this would be a really good opportunity to go through this video that I saw yesterday by Malcolm and Simone Collins, where they were talking about, this was a couple of years ago that they had done this video about how the urban monoculture or progressivism is basically a religion that has taken over the West. And so I'm going to be reacting to that. And I think we're going to go ahead and come up with some good stuff. Add them to stage, and let's get started.
I often say that the urban monoculture loves the LGBT community in the same way Hamas loves hospitals. It sets up the most imperious elements of its operation in the hearts of vulnerable communities to divert attacks against it to those communities, allowing it to claim the moral high ground. This can be seen in its tendency to use the rainbow flag to show conquest over institutions. After a mosque, synagogue, etc. has been conquered, they will hang this out front to direct anger away from the culprit of the cultural erasure and towards the LGBT community.
Now, if you have fallen victim to their propaganda, you might be saying, oh, but what's the difference? I mean, the vast majority of gay people are progressives, right? 45% of gay men in the last election cycle voted for Donald Trump.
Okay, so just to summarize real quick, what the central theme or the central thesis of this work is whenever, well, first of all, you've got an urban monoculture, which is basically cultural liberalism that is taking over most of the institutions in the West. And then when they do that, usually they'll plant the progressive flag on it to go ahead and claim a sense of victory so that you don't look at the actual people that are implementing the progressivism, but you direct your anger toward the LGBT community, which is really interesting. So we'll continue.
Like, no, it needs to redirect the anger at the LGBT community. It needs that the LGBT community has its loudest voices. And it's like, no, it doesn't. It controls our media. It controls our school system. It could use powerful people to be the scapegoat, but it doesn't. It uses the vulnerable members of its community to be the scapegoats, to be the biggest proponents of the most imperious aspects of the culture and the loudest proponents. You know, when you go on TikTok and you see the craziest ultra progressive viewpoints, they are people in these communities.
Would you like to know more?
The stage at which I can't feel my fingertips anymore.
I love that and you're the one who enforces this on the family, to be clear. I always say that you can indulge yourself when you want.
I'm not enforcing this on the children. They say repeatedly, I love the cold. They prefer the cold.
You are an amazing woman, Simone, and I appreciate how austerely you live because it helps us stay focused on what matters, which is moving things forward.
So just some clarification of who these people are. This, Malcolm and Simone Collins, they run the channel Based Camp, and I really like a lot of what they have to do. I have the original linked in the description below if you want to go ahead and check out the original. That way you can subscribe to them as well. Fantastic people. They live in like Pennsylvania or something like that, but they're really awesome people to go ahead and listen to, and they really think through stuff, which is great.
Species during this particular time of challenges that we live in. And one of the biggest challenges was really made clear to me when we were talking to a reporter recently, and they were asking for more clarification on the urban monoculture, right? And it made me realize that one of the mistakes that people can make when dealing with the urban monoculture is to think that it has the similarities it has because it is true, but that is not the case. And so I'm actually going to start by reading my response to the reporter about the urban monoculture.
Dive right in, friend.
While the urban monoculture is not the sole cause of demographic collapse, no realistic solution to demographic collapse is possible without addressing the issues posed by the urban monoculture. The fertility rates within all cultural groups are crashing, but the proximity of a group to the urban monoculture is directly correlated to the speed of the crash. Worse, cultural innovation any family attempts will be fought by the urban monoculture insofar as it deviates from the urban monoculture, which it definitionally will due to the monoculture's low fertility rate.
Okay, so one of the primary objectives of the urban monoculture is to drive down fertility rates. And those groups of people that want to have higher fertility rates are often placed at odds with progressivism, generally speaking, and the urban monoculture specifically. So let's go ahead and dive in more.
The urban monoculture is the dominant cultural group in the world today and one of the descendants of European imperialism. It is what many call wokeness, progressiveness, etc. It sees itself as naturally superior to all other cultural groups and perspectives, seeing them as essentially backward savages, and its imperative is to spread over all of the world's population.
So if you go ahead and go against the progressivist agenda, you are labeled as a barbarian, a savage, or all of these things. We see this all over the news, is if you go ahead and hold to conservative values or family values or Christian values, things of that nature, the urban monoculture will go ahead and try to lambaste you wherever possible and will try to shame you into not holding to your principles. That's exactly what the deal is. And they go ahead and take the things that are right and they make them wrong. Oh, these guys have been together for a while. Let's go ahead and continue.
What makes it hazardous is the urban monoculture has the lowest fertility rate of any cultural group in the world. As such, it only survives by parasitizing children from nearby demographically healthy cultural groups.
Okay, so we see this all the time. So in order for you to go ahead and get more liberals, we know that generally speaking, people that are left of center have fewer children than people that are more conservative, generally speaking. So in order to get more liberals, a lot of times they have to convert them in school. We see this often in primary and secondary education. We see this in higher education. We see this in how aggressively they push the LGBTQ agenda and how they try to go ahead and get people from healthy, intact families and try to pull them to the side. And they really prey on those children that are also from broken families. So it's really interesting because they cannot replicate, like, two men can't replicate, two women can't replicate. So by their very nature, they are not replicable. So that ideology will die out as a matter of biology in terms of certainty. So they have to go ahead and convert people outside of their area in order to perpetuate themselves. Let's continue.
Usually, these are conservative religious groups or importing families from geographically distant cultures and converting their children. This creates an existential problem in our society that I predict will be the core source of conflict over the next century. The dominant cultural group, the group that controls the school system and mass media, must attempt to convert children from neighboring cultures to keep its population numbers stable. Conversion targets of the urban monoculture naturally see the industrial conversion of their children as a threat. There are high fertility groups in every country, but they are all quote unquote weird, where weirdness is defined by cultural distance from the dominant cultural group in society, the urban.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we go ahead and go around in society and we look at, you know what, I can go ahead and change my camera angle. We can do this. All right. So we can see that oftentimes we've got people that will say that, oh, if you have 5 or 6 kids, you're weird. Whereas the cultural norm for people that are progressives is to have 1 to 2 children max. So that gap, as wide as it is, causes people to think that they're weird for being different from what the urban monoculture would have you do.
Monoculture. These groups look like weird secular religions like our family has, ultra-Orthodox Jews, quiverfuls, tradcasts, etc. The problem is, even if the urban monoculture wanted to stop its industrial conversion system, it couldn't. If it did, its population would quickly collapse and it would lose the political and bureaucratic power it has used to subjugate its neighbors, who are at this point very angry. It has proverbially caught the tiger by the tail. The longer it holds the tiger, the angrier the tiger gets. But if it lets go, things will get bloody. Political parties around the world are beginning to drift into 2 factions, one representing the urban monoculture and its goal of cultural genocide, and the other representing a diverse alliance of those attempting intergenerational preservation of their cultural identity.
Right. So you got people that are espousing a viewpoint that cannot replicate itself, cannot self-perpetuate, and you're pitting them against people that are seeking to directly improve the lot of the lives of generations beyond them. So, for instance, generally speaking, I think that most conservative parents are looking to establish the conditions so that their children can have a better time of life than they had growing up, right? And then, so I have the same thing going on with my kids. I want my kids to have a better life than I did. And I think most parents have this similar thought process, whereas people in the urban monoculture, they have no real care for that because they don't have the ability to self-replicate anyway. They just have to go ahead and draw from existing cultures or import from external cultures, like we see with rampant open door immigration in our country.
as to what the urban monoculture is, it can be hard to explain because once one converts, unlike other cultures, it does not demand they identify as a member. They just have to adopt its perspectives, values, practices, morality, ideology, and cosmology. To understand this.
Yeah, so it's important to recognize that it isn't like its own separate religion, like exactly. But the thing is, so long as you agree with all their major cultural positions, all their major policy prescriptions, all of their like prescriptive habits and all of that, then you're part of the club. And it doesn't matter what you identify as other than that. Like you could be a quote unquote practicing Christian. And as long as you believe in gay marriage and all this other stuff, then hey, you're all good by them. But if you're a conservative and you don't believe in these things that they're trying to push off on kids and push off on families, then you are the enemy to them.
In practice, ask an ultra-progressive Jew, Muslim, Catholic, feminist, etc., what their views are on gender, relationships, the nature of the universe, morality, sexuality, marriage, our relation to the environment, etc., and you will get nearly identical answers. Were you to pose the same question to a conservative Jew, Muslim, Catholic, feminist, you would get wildly different answers to each question. I would also note here that the convergent position of the urban monoculture is not due to quote-unquote science, as is will regularly ignore science when it conflicts with the culture's canon just as quickly and aggressively as religious extremists do.
Yeah, so this is really interesting because you can see this in things like crime statistics. You can see this in like global warming and things of that nature. They'll say, trust the science until the science is inconvenient with their political aims. And then all of a sudden they're like, oh, don't worry about the science. You need to go and worry about this science. Don't worry about what the data says otherwise. Don't worry about that. That's not the important part. So they have this innate distrust of science unless it confirms their own biases. Very straightforward stuff. Hey, how's it going, yellow-pilled programmer? Good to see you.
I'm going to go further here because it was actually this last point that I really want to expand upon. Many people, when they look at the convergent beliefs that you have among progressive Catholics or progressive Jews or progressive Muslims, they say these convergent beliefs are just science, right? And it very clearly is not true. It's not true in the field of genetics. It's not true in the field of demography. And I wanted to pull up a few instances of this that we've seen recently. So one I wanted to share with you is this insane graph that about 70% of liberal 12th grade girls believe women are discriminated against in getting a college education, despite the fact that women attain more bachelor's, master's, and PhD degrees than men.
So take that in. So we've got this study that shows about 70% of liberal 12th graders believe in the hype that feminism sells them, that they're going to go ahead and be systematically disadvantaged in higher education, even though we can see in the data that they're getting more bachelor's degrees, more master's degrees, more doctorate degrees. They are getting more of the credentials that they claim they're going to be at a systemic disadvantage to be getting. Completely wild how the propaganda is so detached from reality.
Literally 11 times. So 11,000% more women's only scholarship than men's only scholarships in the US. The level of distortion to reality you have to believe this.
Well, and also, you just look at rates of college graduation and attendance, male to female. There is an obvious skew.
Yeah. Well, and it's something we see with demographic stuff. You know, we'll talk with reporters about demographic stuff, and they'll say, demographers say, this isn't an issue. You cannot predict this stuff long term. I'm like, but you literally can. I can ask the younger generation how many kids they plan to have. I can look at trailing indicators like rates of religiosity. I can look at every aspect of data we have, and it says it's going to get worse over time. I can look.
Yeah, like if you go ahead and see who's entering professions like law, right? So if you've got 80% of new lawyers are women, in 20 years, the legal profession is going to be dominated by women. That's just how demographics work. Unless something collapses between now and 20 years from now to completely derail that process, just by the sake of numbers, you're going to have more females in elements of leadership, judges, and things like that. And we've seen a lot of the dangers that have come from a lot of the left-leaning women taking on judgeships. We've got a lot of these people that are releasing criminals 10, 20, 30, 40 times, and then they're getting out and committing murder and more and more and more crime. And it's just insane. So this is an example of demographic shift over time that they're talking about.
Countries that are further ahead of us in collapse. So they have this distortion field that is not science. And it's very important that we call it out as not science, or not just what is culturally just. So is it just to lie to people? Like, is it culturally just? But this is a huge problem, right? Is they're like, we are not erasing these cultures. You know, when a culture becomes sufficiently progressive, it hasn't been erased, even though they all fly the same flag now, you know, which we'll talk about in a second. You know, I go to an ultra progressive mosque, and I go to an ultra progressive church, and I go to an ultra progressive synagogue. They'll have the same flag in front of every one of these churches. You know, they're like, oh, well, that's just an interesting coincidence. You know, they are trying to protect a vulnerable group. And I'm like, well, there's lots of vulnerable groups in society. Why are they all converging around the same vulnerable group in terms of the flags that they're flying? Which goes to something that I often say.
Because it's really easy to plant a flag and to have it be a representation of a movement. And so that's why they do that. They go ahead and basically take over an institution, get the protection and provision from that overarching institution, and then they claim it as their own. That's the deal. And that's why we go ahead and have Pride Month and have all this stuff coming out where all of a sudden everybody in the US, all of these companies are going to be putting out their Pride, you know, kind of stuff for June. But do you see that in the Middle East? No, of course you don't see that in the Middle East, because they're trying to capture the West is really what the deal is. And so we need to actively resist these things as a part of our everyday life.
Which is the urban monoculture loves the LGBT community in the same way Hamas loves hospitals, which is to say they are using this community, in a community that is in some ways genuinely vulnerable, to redirect anger that would otherwise be pointed at the larger problem, which is the urban monoculture, towards a discriminated subgroup. And then they use that misdirection and the danger that they cause to individuals of that subgroup through their blatant proselytization and attempts to deconvert children using our education system and mass media to anger against this one specific subset of the population.
No, that's really important. That though we have this progressive agenda that basically has its tendrils in most of the major centers of power in the United States and in the West, media, the school system, a lot of levers of power are already controlled by the progressives. And so they are actively working to convert children that are not from progressive families into their culture so that they can replicate by taking other people, which is why it's a parasitic kind of relationship, as opposed to more conservative people where they will just have more kids. And that's the way that they perpetuate their culture, is by having children and inculcating the children with the culture of the parents. And so this is a very different kind of thing. And what's interesting about the progressives is they will go ahead and use the LGBT community kind of as a shield so that people don't look at the levers of power in the first place and call into question their authenticity, their authority, and things of that nature. But instead, we're going to go ahead and scapegoat the LGBTQ community because it's really easy to make them look bad.
Which, to be honest, I don't even know. Like, do most gay men even still support Democrats? I could look this up. Well, I'll look it up after and edit in editing.
I called it. 45% of gay men in the last election cycle voted for Trump over Biden, and 51% voted for Biden. So it's basically half and half about now, and I suspect it's going to flip in the next election cycle or the one after that.
But yeah,
I think they do pretty overwhelmingly. Then there's just like the Lincoln Republicans, and that's it.
Just to clarify, it turns out her intuition was wrong, and that it's about half and half right now, and likely moving towards majority Republican in the next cycle. And I'd also remind our audience of this, any of you who are right-leaning and maybe underestimate just how much the gay community votes Republican, or how amenable they are to joining the Republican Party in mass, at least gay men. So it's really best to not antagonize them, because they really are on our side, and they are not the same in terms of these far crazy, far left, extremist trans activists and stuff like that. Most gay men are very similar to your average Republican.
So that's really important to recognize is there's a big difference between the really far left progressives in that LGBTQ community, like the trans stuff and all the like, hey, let's go ahead and shove drag queen story hour into first grade education and things of that nature. That is one group of people. And then other groups of people are just kind of content to live, and they want a good set of rules that can govern society in such a way that everybody can flourish as best as possible. And I think for the most part, you see that on the part of conservatives, and you see that less so on the part of the urban monoculture and things like that, just because the rules as they are do not lend to them continuing to perpetuate themselves. And they understand that they're going to be dealing with a demographic collapse that will be very dangerous to their worldview generations down the road.
It's the level to which they've basically been able to pull the wool over society's eyes.
Yeah.
Like, and as we pointed out in the studies done on, for example, like they'll take another discriminated group that they'll elevate to a stupid degree, to a degree that it hurts the community, like the Black community. If you look at areas where Democrats have been in control for longer, the Hispanic groups and Black groups have larger distances in contrasted in both earnings and scores on tests when contrasted with the white population. So the policies that are being implemented by progressives are hurting these disadvantaged communities. And this is really obvious in the data.
Which is crazy, because they were going to go ahead and say, oh, well, we'd be disadvantaged if we're with the white people. But the thing is, if you see the results, being in a cohesive area where there are solid rules, there's law, there's order, all of this stuff is well entrenched and acted upon and enacted, these are things that lead to better outcomes for society. And this is just another example, is when you go ahead and end up with these progressive strongholds with progressive like school systems and things like that, they're going to end up with worse and worse results. And if you care about the future of children and whether they're going to be, able to support themselves, or if they're going to end up being like just on the public dole, if you have any concern for the results of your behaviors, you're going to determine what sets of rules and guidelines are best to lead to the best outcomes. And unfortunately, progressives don't seem to really care about that. They just care about the most freedom, the least, surface level harm for the most amount of people, so they say.
In other words, like statistically speaking, and we're not saying necessarily there's causation, but if I were a minority in the United States, I would rather be in a Republican-dominated area, a conservative area, because
you will do better and your kids will do better.
Exactly.
With the local white population.
Which is wild, because you assume that, of course, all democratic progressive policies are meant to, at first and foremost, favor and help minorities and those in need.
Yeah, but I think that this is really worth drawing attention to, because the illusion that what these communities are converging on when they have been infected by this mimetic virus is truth is objectively wrong, is a religious extremist position that is as disconnected from science and as disconnected from reality as most small c conservative religious traditions. Now, I would say that when you get to like ultra conservative religious traditions, you get a higher level of disconnection from reality. But when you're talking about, a normal, I'd say, conservative Christian or conservative Jew, they're probably about as disconnected from mainstream science as progressives are.
Yeah,
I mean, they will deny, when I will talk to them, I will say, well, these human traits have a genetic component to them. And they'll say, no, they don't. And I'm like,
right. But the thing is, are they denying it because there is social stigma associated with agreeing with it? Because if you go ahead and say that certain traits are heritable on a genetic level, you are saying certain things about certain genetic traits. And ever since World War II, science, generally speaking, has been very careful not to say that certain genetic traits lead to certain outcomes without an abundance of proof. Because once we were talking about the whole idea of eugenics and things like that and how that was brought up in World War II, all of a sudden that has basically been off the table in terms of science and technology for a long time, at least in public discourse. So this is why people would be pretty cagey to talk about it, is it's not a popular thing to talk about. in our society because people get silenced for stuff like that.
This isn't a new field. Like, we've been studying this for a long time. Like, yeah, they obviously do. The way a person votes, their personality has a genetic component, but it's not just the research. Like, if you know a human being with kids, you would see this. And they're like, well, what about adopted kids? That would be unfair. And it's like, well, if you know someone with adopted kids, you'll see that those kids are much more different from their parents than people without adopted kids. It's just something you can see if you look at the evidence, even anecdotal evidence within your own life. You really have to blind yourself or like never have been around a child to not realize how much of our personality and the way we act is heritable. Because my kids are doing all sorts of stuff that is like me that I know I didn't teach them.
Undeniable.
But I also want to continue.
Oh, yeah. And even though like my 4 kids are very different from each other, I can see elements of my personality and elements of my wife's personality in the different kids in different proportions, in different ways. And it is interesting because a lot of those things I didn't teach them directly, is they have picked up either from the environment around them or because of the way that we have instilled things into them by the way that we act and the way we behave, led them to take on those characteristics. So a lot of that is very, very interesting.
You here was reading what I wrote. I wanted to have a short interlude there because I didn't want it to be like a boring, just read the piece thing. The urban monoculture parasitizes cultural movements until it becomes the dominant cultural force in them. Then it expels the members that still have adherence to the group's former ideals and culture, wearing that group's identity and history like a skin suit. It then speaks through the mouth of this marionetted corpse to claim its trials as its own.
Yeah, that's really interesting because you often see that in public discourse where people will come from different backgrounds and things of that nature. But if they've been basically inculcated with the urban monoculture, they say the exact same talking points, even though their historic background is substantially different from one another.
Mention the feminist culture because it presents an excellent case study of the phenomenon I have outlined it. As to what fighting the urban monoculture looks like, the most important thing we can do is build a school system not dedicated to cultural genocide. That is what we are doing with the Collins Institute. And I included a clip for her, which I'll play here.
If we combine our music, she'll see that music unites all trolls and that we're all the same and that she's one of us.
Poppy, I mean no disrespect, but king to queen, anything but that.
Why not? I can make it right. History's just gonna keep repeating itself until we make everyone realize that we're all the same.
But we're not all the same.
It's why all our strings are different, because they reflect our different music.
Denying our differences is denying the truth of who we are.
But I'll go a bit further into like the nature of the urban monoculture, because there's this one moment that really got to me when somebody said, what?
Yeah, so that's really interesting. So a lot of people will have this like misguided idea that everybody is the same, that you get born and everybody is a blank slate that you could just program onto without any regard for their natural heritable traits, because, there's just this cultural arrogance on the part of progressives a lot of times, where they just believe that they could go ahead and train people into stuff that would be abjectly rejected by people because of who they are and their fundamental belief set.
Is wokeness to someone? And the person couldn't respond. And I was like, how stupid is that? Like to say that of course they couldn't respond. If you say, what is a culture? That's a very difficult thing for a normal person to answer. Like if you say, what is Judaism, right? Like you can give a few like doctrinal opinions, but like, that's not really what it is as a cultural group. So I wrote a quick piece on this that we can hopefully help explain to people. What is the urban monoculture? Cultural groups are difficult to define and summarize. Consider you asked me to explain European imperial culture. I would say it's a culture that saw everyone outside of it as deplorable and lesser and believed it had a manifest destiny to enlighten these individuals' children and bring them up to date with the quote-unquote civilized world.
Now, we saw that in European imperialism is anytime they would take over a new country or a new territory, they would try to inculcate them into Western values and Western culture, whether or not it was actually compatible with the inherent culture of the area. Very interesting stuff here. And we see this in progressivism all the time.
Yet, this definition would apply equally to the urban monoculture it gave birth to. Were you to ask me to explain Orthodox Jewish culture, I could summarize core beliefs, important texts of the culture, and holidays, but that does not really capture the full culture. For example, Jews 1,000 years ago would appear the same as Jews today if I used that explanation, but culturally they are extremely different. For that reason, I find the best way to describe a cultural group For that reason, I find the best way to describe a cultural group is to describe its evolutionary history. In the case of the urban monoculture, that is something we explore at length in the Pragmatist Guide to Crafting Religion, which we would argue it is something of a mimetic supervirus that evolved out of Hicksite Quakerism. The urban monoculture's belief system is most heavily defined by the belief the goal of society is to remove as much in the moment emotional pain as possible, and thus it is a negative utilitarian in structure. However,
that's interesting because that's often what you see from the progressive left is not a concern for second and third order effects, but an overwhelming concern about how people feel right this second. And if people feel bad right now, it's a bad thing, as opposed to looking at, hey, what are the second and third order effects of our decision making and our policies and things of that nature, and then being willing to deal with the consequences of that. It's kind of like working out. If you go ahead and work out, yeah, if you haven't been doing it for a while, you're going to be really sore if you gave yourself a workout. Now, a lot of leftists, if you were to take that idea of the soreness and the pain, and you would say, oh, well, it's sore and painful, you shouldn't work out. Therefore, people shouldn't work out. Never mind the fact that if you go ahead and train your body, there are second and third order effects of you end up with a better muscle system, you end up with better health outcomes, you end up with tangible benefits that go outside and beyond the momentary pain that's associated with the soreness of having worked out in the first place. That's basically what's going on here, is you have a fundamental clash of values of whether or not it is worthwhile to invest in something, even if it's painful in the short term, for the sake of a better long-term outcome.
It has many other odd ideological structures and traditions. For example, the urban monoculture claims to love diversity, but also does not believe there are any differences between genders, cultures, ethnicities, etc. Why would diversity be a thing of value if we are all exactly the same? It really means it values diversity in its victims. So Simone,
it only wants to show an outer appearance of diversity, because if you go ahead and say that men and women are functionally the same and that men can become women and women can become men, then in terms of diversity, it could go ahead and check boxes. It's like, oh, I've got the token this, I got the token that, I've got this. Because they're all the same, I could go ahead and train them to be exactly what I want, and there we go. This is exactly the problem with cultural leftism in so many ways.
I was wondering if you had any comments on this or areas on this you want to elaborate in terms of understanding it as this like unified religious and cultural structure.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate your highlighting it. And I think the important thing is I grew up in this culture, right? And I always remember thinking how crazy people outside of this cultural group were for not trusting the science and not believing in science. And now we live in this era where like they are presented with peer-reviewed science, like even by their own standards, you know, through the processes that they acknowledge are legitimate, they are denying certain truths. It is really wild to me.
What disagrees with dogma is not science to them, because
yeah,
science
it's just
is defined by what agrees with dogma.
I can't emphasize the extent to which they wholeheartedly see what they're viewing as truth, as science, as the factual basis of things, and those who disagree with them as being backward, uneducated, Bible thumping, or Nazi-esque or racist or whatever enemies.
Yeah, if you don't agree with them, you're the enemy, right? Just the act of disagreeing with them puts you at odds with them in such a way that you cannot be reasoned with. This is really funny because if we try to engage in good faith with people a lot of times, I find that people in our culture nowadays seem to have a hard time of disagreeing without being disagreeable. For example, I have friends that I have disagreements with on a fairly regular basis on a litany of topics. But we can be gentlemanly and we can be congenial and understand that we have more in common that we can go ahead and fight together on than we do in terms of difference. And because we can go ahead and band together on the things that we can unite around, that is for the common good of our friendship, that we can go ahead and set aside petty differences and fight for the things that matter.
And it is the ignorance of their enemies that makes them so evil and dangerous. It is not like, oh, we're dealing with a smart opponent that we must, strategize around. It's never that mindset. The mindset is, you guys are so dumb and full of hate, and you're just afraid. And that
is that not the way that Imperial Europe saw the communities it was contacting? It is a direct descendant of European imperialism.
No, it didn't. No. Like when you actually look at
burden
colonies, as in colonism, as in the American colonies, condescension was the word that was used, and it was a word that was seen as being a noble term. Condescension was being of a person of culture, of education, etc., who benignly and kindly condescended to those who maybe were less educated than them, but didn't hate them for it.
But do you not see elements?
Yeah, so basically when the European imperialists would go ahead and contact a what they thought were savages or backwards, they just had this condescending pity for them, not so much an abject hatred, which is interesting because now in the modern context of cultural liberalism and things like that, where they want to just take over, there is this, it's not even about condescension, it's just outright hatred. It just reminds me of 1984, where how members of the outer party, every day when they got up, they had to go ahead and do the minute of rage, where they would be in front of their little TV thing, and then they'd go ahead and work themselves up into a fury about the made up enemies of the day that Big Brother wanted them to be upset about. Crazy stuff, but we see it as an echo of today's context.
This white man burdens mindset in this viewpoint.
Oh, certainly in the progressive viewpoint today. Yeah, but I don't even know. I don't.
Well, I mean, the dehumanization of the outsider is really core to their community, and you look at where they ignore science. So the way they define science, it's like the way they define racism. Racism has become a meaningful term because to be racist, if I'm how am I racist? I don't look down on Black people, and I have Black friends. I engage with the Black community as equals. And they're well, you're racist because you are not progressive in your views of race. Racism.
So because you don't agree with them on the topic of race, that goes ahead and inherently makes you racist. And then you stack on top of it the idea that people can't be racist against white people and all this other nonsense that they stack on top of things, where now all of a sudden we're looking at things not from objective standards, where in times past, racism was defined something like the view that a race or another has inherent inferiority or superiority to another race. That isn't the definition of racism. Now they have something called privilege plus power or something like that is the measuring guideline for whether or not there could be racism that is involved. And because they say that white people have the highest level of privilege, nobody could possibly be racist against them because they hold the institutional power, which is retarded in terms of day-to-day life. But for the way that they enforce their social orthodoxy on people, it makes perfect sense.
Becomes defined, and this is why they'll be oh, this Black person is a racist. You'll see a white person saying this because they have defined racism as agreeing with the progressive stance on race and not as seeing people of different ethnic groups as truly separate. And this is how they have begun to reinstitutionalize racial segregation in our society. You look at places like California now, and they have separate alert platforms for Black people and Native Americans, and then they have for white people. Then they have from the Amber Alert system, they have the Ebony Alert system and the Feather Alert system.
God, I forgot that, and it sounds so racist. That sounds so incredibly racist.
But it is incredibly racist because they are a racist community.
Yes.
When you define racism as things that disagree with the progressive team's value set, then they don't notice when racism creeps into their own value set.
Barred. It's no holds barred. It's just like fully flamboyant racism and
they are incapable of recognizing it with the definition they have created. And this is the same as true around like trans stuff. If I'm like, well, puberty blockers really, like, the evidence that that is not harmful is not as strong as, like, I've seen a lot of studies that bring up serious.
How about this? Can we hear now? All right, that's a little bit different. All right, so there's that. Let's go ahead and add back to stage. Wow, okay. That was crazy that my system decided to just like throw up all over itself. Awful. All right, back to it. So let's see. Here we go. Let's go back. I went ahead and was talking about puberty blockers and how there was an issue with how 2 years ago is when they had recorded this, and already the studies were negative in terms of the effects of it. And then the studies have continued to come out showing how much of a negative effect there are in terms of that is concerned. So it's really interesting to see how that goes. Let's continue with the video.
Serious concerns about the puberty blockers, and they're like, but it isn't science because it disagrees with what we want. Like, science is defined by what they want. And this creates a problem in outsiders trusting them, because as soon as you see this and you realize that science may align with something that progressives wants, like global warming or something like that, there's really no reason to trust the data. Because even if global warming was not happening, they would be saying all of the exact same things they're saying about global warming, because it gives.
Yeah, so it just goes to say that so long as, quote unquote, the science agrees with what they want, they are totally good with the science, and they'll keep parroting the talking points. And then it leads people to be less and less trusting of the institutions, because if the science did go with them, they're going to say the same thing. If the science didn't go with them, they're going to say the same thing. So then we just recognize that they're liars at the core, and that they're willing to lie in any way, shape, or form in order to go ahead and get their agenda passed. And so we should be very concerned with this when we know that our opposition is comfortable lying about everything to try to get more and more power. And that is exactly why we need to be on the watch for these things, especially in our own families. We need to go ahead and make sure that our kids are well taken care of and things like that, because otherwise, they're going to come for our kids, just like we saw with the whole trans thing, is they actively try to convert these children instead of just letting them be, because they're going to eventually grow out of a lot of these things that are going on in our culture. Let's continue.
And more state power and stuff like that. And it's really hard to believe that global warming is happening as a conservative when you see them, the progressives, the Green Party in Germany, shutting down the nuclear power plants with no viable alternative and just creating more carbon. One of the things that progressives often can accuse us, the pronatalists, and it's true, we're trying to bring the best of humanity together to take to the stars, to, reform this planet, to do amazing things in the future. And they're like, so you want to leave this sinking ship? Like, you don't want to fix it? And I'm like, we tried. We built the nuclear power plants. Those were put up by conservatives. Elon, for example, he built Tesla. He tried to make emissionless cars popular. He did more to making them popular than anyone else. And now you tar and feather him because he also promotes free speech?
Yeah, so that's wild. So if you go ahead and say that global warming is a problem and that carbon is the issue, and you propose a solution of, hey, let's go ahead and adopt electric vehicles, or we take on nuclear power, those things, scientifically speaking, in every way, shape, or form, will go ahead and drive down emissions. But as soon as you step outside of the social orthodoxy, you go ahead and are willing to tar and feather them that are doing the work of limiting the things that you claim are a problem, and you're going to fight against them because they don't agree with your policy prescriptions. That is a huge issue. And you're not going to end up having a good team that way, unless you're just going to strong arm everybody at every turn, which is basically what the left typically does. Is if you step outside a line, they're going to go ahead and employ everything to fight against you.
Because that is out of control. Because free speech is an existential threat to people who control information in a society. If one cultural group controls mass media and they control the school system, then of course freedom of speech is an existentially threatening idea to them, because they can't have a free market of ideas where people can point out the things that we're pointing out, where truth becomes a danger to them.
So that's something to be said. If people are trying to silence you and your opinion, and you have the facts behind you, you need to be paying attention to why they're trying to silence you. Chances are the things that you're saying are inconvenient to them. Now, if the things that you are saying are untrue, or there is no foundational basis for that, that can be worked out in the marketplace of ideas and things of that nature. But if the things that you are saying are just inconvenient to them, they're going to try to shut you up. And that's just how it works. If they try to control the flow of information in society, they have a vested interest in shutting you up, because you will stand for truth and not stand for whatever they try to feed you. Let's continue.
Well, so, okay, if we're saying that this form of toxic progressivism is a virus, if we're saying that this form of toxic progressivism is a religion, does that change the tactics that people should use to defend themselves from it, address it?
The analogy I use is it's a religion in the same way that contagious canine venereal cancer, so canines have a type of cancer that's contagious, is a dog. It is a parasitic cancer that evolved out of a religion, but it is not a religion. It doesn't have.
Well, what's interesting is there are a few things that it has that would help you to look at it like a religion. Like, for example, it's got doctrines, it's got orthodoxy, it's got the ability to enforce standards on its own people. It has got essential rituals. It's got essential guidelines. It has got participatory nature to it. It has got its idols that it provides worship to. These are things that parasitic leftism and the urban monoculture have that is similar to a religion.
All of the code it needs as a cultural group to sustain itself. It absolutely can only survive through cultural parasitism. It can only survive by taking the children of other people, because it lacks the cultural DNA that motivates reproduction and self-sacrifice, which I actually talk about.
Oh, that is true, because they're unwilling to fight for something that they're not going to personally benefit from. Whereas people that are typically more conservative or more religious will absolutely be willing to plant a tree whose shade they're not going to enjoy for the sake of bettering future generations. And so when we look at parasitic leftism, all they can do is convert the healthy or the unhealthy members of other groups, because they don't really have the means of perpetuating themselves. The people that are in progressive leftism have much lower birth rates than people on the right, for example.
A bit later in this piece. Not a piece, but like email I sent, which I was like, okay, I should probably share this. It also has an ethnic, sexual, and gender-based dominance hierarchy bordering on a caste system, whereby the status of each of these traits is determined by the perceived traits' impact on the status in the plurality of neighboring cultures. This provides differential pressure for individuals with these traits to convert and loudly proselytize the more bizarre and nonsensical elements of the monoculture. I often say...
So this is kind of like the idea of You have the oppression Olympics, where you have people that have more disadvantages are at the top of the hierarchy, and then people that have the most advantages are at the bottom of the hierarchy from their perspective. And so we're going to go ahead and say that there is this huge amount of love for certain disadvantaged groups because they meet so many of the check boxes at the same time that they get thrust up as like this paragon of things that we should look at. And then those groups, like the LGBT group, they can go ahead and do more and more ridiculous things and not face social stigma and social shame from the leftists. Like they can go ahead and dress like complete ridiculous people out in public and go and insert themselves into public education, like through the whole drag queen story hour kind of thing. And people look at it and go, wow, that's so brave and so stunning. Whereas people on the right are like, what are you doing to our children? Get them away from my kids. And then all of a sudden you got people on the left going, oh, why are you trying to take the kids away from this? Why are you shaming us for doing these things? We're protecting this group of people. Same kind of thing. It's ridiculous.
The urban monoculture loves the LGBT community in the same way Hamas loves hospitals. It sets up the most imperious elements of its operation in the hearts of vulnerable communities to divert attacks against it to those communities, allowing it to claim the moral high ground.
Oh, absolutely. So this reminds me of Hamas when they would go ahead and they would put their headquarters under a hospital so that if somebody would go ahead and attack the hospital because they're trying to get at the valid military target underneath the hospital, all of a sudden now you have the power of shame and moral high ground to say, oh, look, they're attacking hospitals. They shouldn't be doing that. Never mind, are they using people as human shields along the way? They're being cowardly, but then they're using institutions that are inherently protected as a shield to do all the nefarious stuff. It's the same way with a lot of this LGBT stuff is they go ahead and go into an institution and they are shielded as a minority victim group. And then all of a sudden, anything they do has like this implicit social check where they're like, oh, okay, yeah, anything they want to do is fine. But I think that nowadays people are waking up to that and they're not willing to give a free ride to that kind of thing anymore. And I think it is the right thing to challenge them whenever possible.
This can be seen in its tendency to use the rainbow flag to show conquest over institutions. After a mosque, synagogue, etc. has been conquered, they will hang this out front to direct anger away from the culprit of the cultural erasure and towards the LGBT community.
And I would remind listeners here again that 45% of gay men voted for Donald Trump in the last election cycle. It's like bull baiting with a red flag to get the bull to attack the wrong location. Or even more hilariously, they've dressed a child all up in red and let him run around the ring with the bull chasing him so that they can merrily pick it off while it's distracted.
Again, I need to be clear. There is no agency or plan in any of this here. These are all just culturally evolved mechanisms. The iteration of the culture that did this outcompeted the ones that actually tried to protect these communities.
Yeah, so it makes sense that if you're going to go ahead and criticize members of the LGBT community, is you're going to go ahead and criticize very specific things that you see and go after those things. Like when they're trying to actively convert your kids to be trans, like that's a thing to actively fight against. And that's the thing that for years they've been like trying to get done in a sneaky way where like there's been laws passed in California and things like that where they don't have to tell the parents that they're going to be doing these things to their children and they're going to be giving the children these kinds of things. And that is wildly disrespectful. But if you are like the leftist progressive, you believe the children belong to the state. You don't believe that the children actually belong to the parents. And so because of that, you allow for all of these just like insane things to happen as a matter of law to protect progressive idealism and progressive ideology from the parents fighting against them, because the last thing that they want is parents actually caring about their children and loving their children, because that would completely undo a lot of their ability to try to convert the kids, which is why we have so many broken homes in the United States. Is a lot of the systems are set up in such a way to cause women to file for divorce and cause women to leave the home and things like that, and to cause damage in these families. it is intentional on their part because they set up the systems to be that way.
And this is something I want to take a quick aside on here, because there isn't, people are like, no, it needs to redirect the anger at the LGBT community. It needs that the LGBT community as its loudest voices. And it's like, no, it doesn't. It controls our media. It controls our school system. It could use powerful people to be the scapegoats, but it doesn't. It uses the vulnerable members of its community to be the scapegoats, to be the biggest proponents of the most imperious aspects of the culture and the loudest proponents.
Yeah, because if you go ahead and crucify the loudest, most flamboyant members, it doesn't go ahead and actually deal with the problem underneath. It doesn't deal with the fundamental problem. You can see these people be martyred for the cause, and then all of a sudden you get other people that are like excited to hop on board with the cause, and that's just, it protects those people that are actually implementing this progressive ideology in the first place, rather than protecting the most vulnerable parts of the people that are doing the preaching of their version of the gospel, for example.
You know, when you go on TikTok and you see the craziest ultra progressive viewpoints, they are people in these communities. They are not the actors who have security. They are not the politicians. They are not the ultra wealthy tech company CEOs who take the most milquetoast perspectives, which is where if the community was virtuous, it would be driving anger. And you say, well, no community could work that way. Well, yeah, they can. Many conservative communities, especially ultra conservative communities, it is the leaders of those communities that take the responsibility and the burden of the social attacks against those communities, and promoting and keeping the communities on a virtuous path insofar as they define virtue, which means pushing some of the crazier ideas.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. So you see that even today, where you have leaders on the conservative side, they're going to go ahead and push the Overton window, you know, bit by bit. And they're the ones that get all the social backlash on social media because of things. You see this with Andrew Tate. You see this with people like Joel Webbin. You see this with Tucker Carlson. There's a lot of people out in the forefront pushing back on this liberalism and this ideology that are just getting jacked up in the society in terms of social media, because they're the ones that are pushing on the furthest ends of the fringe. And so they end up with the biggest consequences as a result.
Crazier ideas insofar as craziness is defined by distance from the dominant cultural group in society or other cultural groups in society. Mm-hmm. So the urban monoculture spreads by infiltrating institutions, then expelling members who have allegiance to the institution's original mission. I mentioned this in the case of the feminist movement above, but we see this phenomenon play out in companies, religions, etc. Once the mimetic infection reaches a certain stage, the institution will start building new structures designed to ensure ideological conformity, further the spread of the mimetic virus, and expel anyone who appears to show immunity. An example of these types of structures are ESG departments. The urban monoculture tells people that they have a duty to identify as whatever they feel in the moment and do whatever makes them feel best in the moment, insofar as that does not hurt other people. While this may seem...
That's really interesting, because when you look at people on the left and they're looking to defend matters of public policy, they will often use harm as a metric for what public policies should look like, because you should go ahead and limit harm is the primary principle or the primary ethos by which they do things. But the thing is, harm in what way? And most often it has to do with emotional harm. It has to do with harm of the moment. It doesn't have to do with these like long-term second and third order effects. Very interesting stuff.
Benign as a commandment, a culture that uses this as their North Star is going to be very bad at motivating sacrifice and thus have a very low fertility rate. It is also going to have huge mental health issues, but that is beside the point. It is important to note that the urban monoculture is not just a continuation of utilitarian left-leaning ideas optimized around increasing aggregate world happiness and equality. When choosing between those goals and removing in-the-moment suffering, the urban monoculture always chooses the removal of in-the-moment suffering. For example, if you point out that being overweight is unhealthy, this could cause in-the-moment pain to an individual, even though it would be in their long-term best interest. So the urban monoculture...
So this is why they get really upset at people for fat shaming, even though we know reasonably that being overweight has long-term consequences. You end up with higher incidence rates of things like diabetes and heart disease and high cholesterol and other things like that. And that is true. That has been the case for an extended period of time. But instilling some form of social shame is so painful to their psyche that they're like, oh, you shouldn't fat shame people, because of the immediate pain in the moment. Let's not worry about the long-term impacts of that behavior and of that that set of habits and what's going to happen with that. That's not the concern for them. The concern is right now, what do they feel? And that is no way to build a society, because then people aren't going to be willing to sacrifice. People aren't going to be willing to invest in the future. And that's why we see such a huge difference between parasitic leftism and people that are more on the conservative side of the house.
Culture suppresses it. Banning test scores in high schools obviously increases inequality by allowing rich kids to go to their extracurricular where they will still be tested. However, doing so removes in the moment negative emotions. Government programs handing out drugs on the streets obviously increase inequality, but also remove in the moment suffering. So
that's a really interesting point that they brought up, is if you go ahead and get rid of formalized testing from public education to make dumb people feel better about themselves because they don't fail tests, it doesn't actually remove the long-term consequences. If they don't have a mastery of the material that they've been taught, they're going to have problems down the road. But people that are wealthier will find ways of testing their capabilities and testing their competence as a matter of how they raise their children. They go ahead and put them in extracurriculars. They put them in sports. They put them in things where their capabilities are put to the test and the results speak for themselves. If you are competent at singing, you will sing well. If you are not competent at singing, it's going to sound terrible. And those are the natural consequences of a combination of your talent and your preparation and your practice come together to demonstrate mastery or competence in a given area. And so when we go ahead and remove the sting of defeat from people in order to help them feel good in the moment, you remove their ability to recognize the sting of failure as a symptom and a sign for them to do better in other areas. That's the difference.
It's really important to know that this is not the progressive culture you grew up with. It borrowed some of those elements. And I think a lot of people who haven't been targeted yet by the urban monoculture yet don't realize how much it's changed.
Yeah, I think that is probably the vast majority of people who still identify as progressives and then unknowingly support progressive policies, is they did grow up with this more sane version and they don't realize how insane it's gotten. And yeah, you're probably totally spot on. Which is to say that we're not saying, like, it's actually a very small minority that's gone off the rails, but
they have all the positions of power.
Yes.
And they have been able to utilize those positions of power to transform our society in a direction that hurts the very groups that they claim to want to protect.
Mm-hmm.
And they're small and they're loud. They are the loudest element. And so they have an outsized voice compared to how many people they actually represent as a whole. Like, when we go ahead and see, like in TV shows and video games, and there's this insistence on representation, for example, and we say, well, every movie has to have a token this and a token that, and you only have room for 10 people on the cast of major characters, and you say at least one of them has to be LGBTQ, and at least one of them has to be specifically trans, and one of them has to be specifically disabled. Well, if we look at the number of people that are actually trans in the United States, it is far less than the 10% that they would be representing in that cast of 10 characters. So just wild stuff here.
You can see this in the data, as I've said. And so I want to be clear here, right? Like, a lot of people, they'll come to me and they go, no, this is only the extremists who believe those things. I am a progressive and I define progressive beliefs by what I believe, right? Because I identify as a progressive. And when I say, well, those aren't really progressive beliefs anymore. Those are actually much closer to conservative beliefs today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but no one, when we say that, believes us.
Yeah, it just reminds me of the meme where you have the moderate, and then you got the person on the left, and you got the person on the right, and then the person on the left just keeps going further and further left to the point where the moderate looks like he's close to the right. That just goes to show just how much denigration has happened on that side of the aisle, politically speaking.
They don't believe us because they haven't been targeted yet. And then I constantly see the same story playing out again and again. They see something in their company or something like that they thought was reasonable because they hadn't had to be in a bureaucratic environment that was dominated by this new cultural group yet, you know?
Well, and you see this with Blocked and Reported. You see this with the Free Press. There is this new class of elite progressive that is now seen as like heterodox or even sometimes labeled by the establishment as conservative merely because they have been like, wait, no, this is crazy. But they still maintain their progressive stances of the days of yore, which is to say, like, what traditionally progressivism was rather than off the rails insanity that it is now, right?
And I think that it's easy to see when you're a progressive to dehumanize your enemies when you do not look for disconfirming evidence of the stuff they're telling you. It's easy to, like, a great example of this is the Don't Say Gay bill, for example, right? Like, when I point out the conservatives haven't really done that much that's really homophobic in a while, they're like, what about the Don't Say Gay bill? And I'm like, actually, I know one of the people who wrote that bill. And the number one progressive complaint that people could use that bill to get a teacher fired for being gay or telling her students that she's gay, literally that was in, like, the language when the bill was first written could have been used to do that. But the conservatives within the conservative movement read it and they said, oh, we need to take that language out so that it is only the teaching of sexuality to children, not like an individual's identity, not their home.
Yeah, so they were smart to go ahead and take that piece out of the bill so that it wasn't able to be used as a weapon. But because it was in a first draft, people on the left still go ahead and use it as a tool or as a weapon, as if it is actually the case when that language was stripped out of the bill before it got passed.
Home life, not them even mentioning these things to students. It's only the teaching of sexuality that we want to prevent, or like specific sexual acts to students. And yet progressives, they don't know this. They don't believe this because it's hidden from them in their media. The conservative movement has significantly moderated its views on these issues. And in them using things like the LGBT community as their scapegoat constantly, the progressives using it, they are reigniting genuine animosity within the conservative party that when conservatives end up replacing them, which they will eventually, it's just demographics, is going to be very, very bad for people with those traits who we do not want to see come to harm due to the short-sightedness of these fraudsters that are claiming to represent them. And
yeah, so they go ahead and basically use them as a tool to enact policy. And then when inevitably things are going to collapse because they can't perpetuate themselves, then these people that have depended on the progressive left to protect them this whole time, they won't have that shield of protection to do all the insane stuff that they had been doing. And then they end up getting tried for the insane stuff that they were doing. It's just one of those things due to statutes of limitations and other things. It's pretty wild.
And it's really sad that it's gotten to this stage. But what I say with something like Trump, the point I was making here is they say, if you don't know that much, if you haven't really looked at his policies, if you haven't really looked at the effects that they've had on a global stage, and you're just viewing this, it's easy to see him as like a crazy person or a bad person, or everyone who supports him as a bad person. But when you really engage with it, even claims around things like that the election might have had some issues, when you really genuinely engage with it, instead of just spout talking points, you can see how a well-meaning, intelligent person could come to that perspective. I'm not saying it's true, but I'm saying it's not insane. Okay.
But yeah, people will treat you as if you're insane for just questioning the proper narrative, which is why things went sideways the way they did with January or with J6 and stuff like that. That's just one of those things.
And yet progressives are taught that these are insane positions. And it is going to lead.
Well, it's not an insane position when their candidate loses an election, but
then there was definitely some form of election tampering. But it's going to lead to them doing more and more blazingly anti-democratic things as they dehumanize their opponents. And eventually, this is going to lead to something like a civil war. If they keep this up, if they brazenly continue to continue to use other families and other cultural groups to supply their population, e.g. parasitize their children using the educational system they employ, well, if you can't understand why people are existentially angry about that and why that's going to cause problems in the long term, I don't know how to communicate. Like, we are trying to defuse a situation that is going to end with you, the progressive group, suffering because you have.
Yeah, that's really interesting because this was, a couple of years ago they had done this, and this sounds so familiar to things that are going on in Britain and Europe right now, where there is so much animosity towards a lot of the immigrants that have come in and caused a lot of crime and stuff like that in their areas, where now people are banding together and be like, no, we're done with this. we are so fed up with all of the nonsense that is coming from this that now the progressive side is starting to go ahead and face backlash for this. Interesting stuff. And it's not like it's not predictable. If you're going to go ahead and do things that actively undermine the integrity of your society and your country, you're going to face political backlash. It is a nature of the beast. However, if your side of the aisle is only perpetuated by proselytizing or converting people from the main area, or from like healthy families or even broken families, if you can't perpetuate yourself with your own ideology and you have to take from other people, this is going to be a consistent problem over and over and over again. And this is why I encourage men to go ahead and stand up and do the things that you need to do to protect your family and to lead well and to care for your family and your children and to stand up as a strong member in your community so that we can band together to have good things happening to fight against these crazy things that are going on in our society. Let's go ahead and wrap this up.
Have a low fertility rate right now. You are the group that will be the vulnerable one in the future. And we are trying to help you before things get bad.
And there you
have it. That's kind of the deal. So that was, let's see, what was this thing called? It was down in the description. They called their video An Anatomy of the Urban Monoculture. So that's the deal, is the parasitic left can only exist insofar as they have groups to steal from, whether inside the country or by inviting it in from an external source, and then converting them to their own point of view by giving them like goodies and putting them on the dole. And once you get people on the dole and they're comfortable with getting free stuff, well, they're not going to go ahead and vote against free stuff. So then you end up with all these people that are voting just to get free stuff from the treasury. And that's a problem across pretty much every first world nation right now, is you have this increasing concentration of people that are net takers and not net givers to the society. Well, I figured this would be appropriate to react to, given that this is the 1st of June and this is the first of what people call Pride Month. And so I think that we should actively fight against this as men and as people that are looking for a just and stable society, because we know that with strong families, we can have a strong society. I hope you guys have a fantastic rest of your day.